Good afternoon, it's Erev Shabbos Chodesh, Parshas Bahar B'chol Kaisai. Today is Chaf Aleph Iyar, which means it's not even Shabbos B'chol Sivan. And for a rare change, we're learning a Mamer a week ahead. This Mamer is from Shabbos Mevorchim Sivan, which is also Parshas Bamidbar, and it was Erev Rosh Chodesh. Rosh Chodesh was on Sunday, which is exactly how it is this year. Next Shabbos will be Shabbos Mevorchim and Machar Chodesh, and it'll be Bamidbar. In other words, the Kviyas of Tafshin Lamed Hey of 1975 is the same, at least in this part of the year, as the Kviyas of this year, Tafshin Pei Gimel B'Hashgacha Pratas. And we're learning a Mamer. So the last Mamer we learned was a Lagbema Mamer, and it was quite a Mamer. I gave 4 classes on it, and I still feel like I want to speak more about it. In other words, first of all, some of the things I may have said, A, may have not been correct, and B, may have not have been clear. V'hashenis, there's a certain Fabrengen value to that Mamer. I feel that we could still have explored, and I guess in a different universe where I had more time and more koyach, I would have given a 5th class just as a inspirational Fabrengen, as a sequel to the Mamer, but the Revival, at least I didn't do it. I can still do it because the Mamer is still fresh, although I've already moved on to this Mamer, and that's how this works. You put yourself into something and you live it for a week, and you read it and you reread it, you learn it and you relearn it, then you teach it and you put it down and you take the next one, and then you can't imagine ever forgetting it, and you do forget. You forget relatively quickly. Certainly the gishmak, the feeling of joy that the Mamer gave. Anyway, ready to start Chag HaShavuos. This Mamer is 5 pages, which is less than half the size of the previous Mamer, and I'm teaching it in 2 classes. I don't need to. I could teach it in 1. I choose to. I choose to because I want to give each one of the 2 big ideas or big topics, big forms of this Mamer their own attention. So we'll do one now, we'll do another one in Mitzvah Hashem, whenever that in Mitzvah Hashem turns out to be. Because the Mamer is a juxtaposition of 2 ideas. The first idea is Machar Chodesh, which may be the most frequently said Mamer of the Rebbe. You know, we have in the Hayom Yom that the Rabbi used to repeat the same Mamer again and again, and one of the reasons they did so was the tide as an avid to purify the air. And the implication is that occasionally they would literally repeat the Mamer verbatim, word for word, again and again and again. Like the Rebbe Marash must have 11 or 12 Michamoichas. He was the Rebbe for all of 18 years. How many Maimorim Machar Chodesh did the Rebbe say? There's many Maimorim that are repeated a lot. There's a lot of Pada B'Sholoms. Of course, there's many Basi Laganis, but they're all different. But Maimorim Machar Chodesh are quite similar. This Mamer Machar Chodesh is unique. It's not exclusive, but it's unique because it juxtaposes Machar Chodesh with the Parshas HaShavua. Think about it. How many Machar Chodesh could there be in a year, in theory? Machar Chodesh means that Sunday is Rosh Chodesh. Now, I don't know the calendar well enough, but you could probably figure out how many Rosh Chodesh could occur on Sunday. Some of them can't. Like, for example, Rosh Hashanah is like Adu Rosh, so you know for sure that the Chodesh Tishrei cannot be on Sunday, so you're never going to have a Machar Chodesh Erev Rosh Hashanah. But if you went through the other 11 or 12 months, if you include 2 others, how many Machar Chodesh could there be in theory? I'm almost sure that Cheshvan could be a Machar Chodesh and Kislev could be Machar Chodesh. I don't know. I don't want to speculate, but you can calculate. I'm sure it's not all 11. There are many months that, because of the structure of the calendar, cannot be on certain days of the week, and consequently Rosh Chodesh cannot be on a Sunday. But there's certainly a bunch, right? A bunch. Let's say 7 or 8. Now, if there are 7 or 8 Machar Chodesh, that means there is probably 15 or even 20 Parshias that Machar Chodesh could fall. Why? Because let's say there's 7 Machar Chodesh a year. You have to figure that some years there'll be an earlier Parsha, and some years there'll be a later Parsha. Let's say Chodesh or Chayesara, for example, or Vayeshev and Miketz, for example, and so on. And again, I didn't research this. When you add the leap years, so the extra Adar is going to split the Pashas and Vayikra into two, where you're going to have Vayikra, Tzav, Shmini, then you're going to have Tazriya, Metzera, Achrei Kedoshim, before Pesach. So there's a whole additional realm of possibilities of Machar Chodesh. So if you're a good mathematician and you love the calendar, you could sit down and tabulate, number one, how many months, how many Rosh Chodeshim could fall on Sunday, which means how many Machar Chodesh there could be. Number two, each of those of Machar Chodesh, which Pashas of the week could they occur? There's probably in each case two. So you could double the possibilities of how many Pashas are associated with Machar Chodesh. Over the years, one of the things that Rebbe has done is say Mamer and Machar Chodesh and connect it to the Pasha that happens to occur of that month. Or slightly differently, say Machar Chodesh in a particular Chodesh and explain the connector of Machar Chodesh and the theme of that particular month. Let's say Kislev or Tevis. So you're saying one Mamer, Machar Chodesh. And as the Rebbe says in the very beginning, Machar Chodesh always begins the same way. The content of the Mamer changes to some extent. But Machar Chodesh, one of the basic things of Machar Chodesh is the one that we have in our Mamer, that bittul brings to renewal, right? Which is brought in so many of the Rebbe's Maimon of Machar Chodesh. I don't know exactly how many, but in many of the Maimon of the Rebbe Machar Chodesh, that's the theme. And what the Rebbe does in this Maimon, as he does in many other Maimorim or in a collection of other Maimorim, is connect them to the particular Parsha or to the particular Chodesh in which that Machar Chodesh occurs, which makes Machar Chodesh Maimorim very dynamic. The basic theme of an Efkadata Ki Poked Meishavecha may be constant, but juxtaposing it against all the Pashas HaShavua that it could theoretically fall on, and juxtaposing it against all of the months which it theoretically could occur, it becomes very complex, very dynamic, very full of detail. And this one is a Machar Chodesh that's discussing Sivan and Bamidbar. In other words, discussing Matan Torah, which is upcoming, and the Pashas HaShavua, which is Bamidbar Sinai. Bamidbar Sinai El Meyed. So I learned the Mamer. I've been learning Mamer for most of the week, even as I was teaching the old one. And the Mamer has two halves. One half deals with Machar Chodesh, basically by itself, the topic of Machar Chodesh. And the other half deals with how Machar Chodesh is connected to Matan Torah and to Shavuos, the idea of Matan Torah and Shavuos, and the consequence of Matan Torah and Shavuos. And it focuses on the two terms, Bamidbar Sinai Ba'ayel Moed. And Midbar Sinai Ba'ayel Moed, and this Maimah are going to come to parallel the Ki Pocket Meishavecha, the Bittel, and V'nifkadata the Zikaron, the two ideas of Rosh Chodesh. That with this Bittel, this renewal, Midbar Sinai is going to represent the Bittel, and Ayel Moed is going to represent the Chodesh and the renewal. You will find in our second class, when we do the Matan Torah version, the two is going to become three, and possibly going to become four. But at least for right now, we have a Maimah, it's 5 pages. So I'm giving it in 2 shiur. The average length of a shiur is 2.5 pages, which is for us not particularly long, which means you'll be able to keep track, you'll be able to hold with me until the end. The first shiur is simply going to discuss Machar Chodesh, the whole idea of that the moon disappears completely so that a new moon can be born, and when the new moon is born, it's called a moiled, and that this whole phenomena of the moon disappearing completely and being reborn is part of how the Eibusha designed the world to reflect the purpose of the world, and more specifically the nature of the Jewish people, Ukafishi is Ba'alakama. So the first shiur is a strictly Machar Chodesh shiur, the second shiur is a Sivan / Matan Torah / Pashas Bamidbar shiur, which we're going to be doing next. So, I don't want to waste time, let's go into the Maimah proper, okay? But before I do, I want to say something now, which is not negiyah to right now, but it's negiyah to this shiur. And that is that all of us understand that Torah is infinite. There's unlimited knowledge and wisdom in the Torah, and hafachba the kulaba. You can study the Torah and study the Torah. Everything you want is in the Torah. Every bit of truth is in the Torah. Just know how to find it. And if you don't find it, it's your fault. You didn't look properly. And this is, of course, particularly true about the creation account, Ma'aseh Bereishis, the first Perek, the first Parsha, the first Parshas in Bereishis, which have the creation narrative, the story of creation. They're, of course, describing the most cosmic event that ever occurred in 31 tiny little psukim. So clearly, these psukim are layered; they're full of detail and layers. And each one of the Asara Ma'amares has a an entire collection of possible interpretations. So, allow me to do this. One of the 10 Ma'amaris happened on a Wednesday, when the Eibishter created the sun and the moon and the stars, and the fish, of course, and the Taninim. So we read in the Chumash, Hashem made the two great luminaries, the first great luminary to light by day, and the smaller luminary to rule the night, and of course the pasuk that finishes and the stars to compensate for the fact that the lunar light is less than the solar light, so the stars to compensate for that light deficiency. That's what Rashi says. As strange as that may sound from a strictly physical perspective, that's how Rashi explains the pasuk. And of course we all know the question. The pasuk contradicts itself in mid-sentence. It begins by saying Shnei Hamer Segadem, the two great luminaries, and then proceeds to call them Moed HaGadol and Moed HaKatan, the great luminary. Of course, this is a question that the Gemara asks, and of course the Gemara answers that Hashem was going to make the sun and the moon the same time, and the moon protested. What was the moon's protest? Two kings share the one crown, and Hashem tells the moon, "You're right, go and diminish yourself." So the moon says, "Excuse me, Lefisha Marte Hogun, Davar Hogun is Esmait, because I said the truth. I'm the one who has become smaller, the sun becomes smaller." So the Eibishter answers the moon by saying, therefore Yisrael Nikra Shmecha, the Jewish people are going to carry your name, Shmuel HaKatan, David HaKatan, whatever that is, that the moon, who's, quote, being punished for saying the right thing, that you can't have two kings sharing one crown, is going to be rewarded by the fact that the Yidden are going to carry the name of the moon. That's what the Gemara says in Masechta Chulin. Everybody knows this Gemara. Now, what's the philosophical meaning behind this? It's really simple and logical and important. The philosophical meaning behind this is that parity doesn't work. If everything is equal, it cancels each other out. We live in an age, in the 21st century, where intellectuals and the social engineers and the New Agers, the people who are trying to change the world for better, for the right reasons, they're motivated by kindness and goodness, believe that everything has to be the same. It's the socialist idea, it's the communist idea. In theory, it's the best idea. It's good in every way except for one, it's not practical. And because it's not practical, it almost festers corruption, it almost causes people to cheat and to hurt each other, as we saw happen in the Soviet Union. But life, I tell my students all the time, life is not fair. I mean, maybe when you're 2 years old, things are fair. Fairness ends in pre-Monet or kindergarten. The world is not fair. It's not meant to be fair. It's meant for every person to find a place, but we don't have equal places. It doesn't work. Parity is a lie. It's like creating a person, and because the head is the most important part of the body, every part of the body wants to be the head. Create a body of 248 heads, just heads. So we'll be wonderfully intelligent and be absolutely crippled and immobile, and won't be able to feed itself. Won't be able to do what the mind of the 248 heads can figure out, because it doesn't have the tools to carry it out. We're not the idea of everything being the same is a fallacy. It's a lie. And it's represented very explicitly in the creation account, where Hashem makes two sources of light equal, and immediately they're rendered unequal. It's a message. And the message is, if things are equal, they destroy each other. If there's going to be sustainability, there has to be imbalance, not balance. And to use a physical example for this, and I'm not saying that this is true al pi Torah, but this is a physical fact. There's something called matter and antimatter, and there's a very, very small percentage of antimatter in the universe. And physicists say that if you join together matter and antimatter, you get pure energy, which is far more energetic even than nuclear energy from fission or from fusion. And they don't understand why the percentage of antimatter in the universe is not the same as the matter. If everything began at a single point, so just like there's a lot of matter, there should be a lot of antimatter, and they find only a trace of it. Now, I don't know what's the physical explanation for it, but the spiritual explanation is because there would be equal amount of matter and antimatter, they would cancel each other, they would destroy each other, there would be no world. And that's the pnimius of the story, that the sun and the moon were made the same size in theory, and immediately it was determined that in order for there to be a sun, in order for there to be a moon, they cannot be even. To use the classic lashon of the Mamer from the Rabbi Maharash, where he addresses the question in the Gemara, If Hashem loves poor people, why doesn't He feed them Himself? And the answer, of course, is the Eibishter created a world of mashpia makabel. There has to be a giver and a receiver. And if you study the world even on a very basic physical level, on a biological level, everything in the world is a taker and a giver. Everything gives, even if it's just waste. The waste of one is life for another. That's why you have in Tanya from the Gemara, at the most severe klipa is a mosquito, a yitush, a gnat. That's machnes ve'eni meitzi. That doesn't give out even waste. Because in the Eibishter's world, it's a hierarchy. It's not a parity. It's not the same. And it begins in the creation account with the idea that Hashem says to the moon, but what we learn from the story as we develop it is that sometimes being the underdog has an advantage over being the superior. The sun is obviously much stronger than the moon. Everything that the moon has it gets from the sun. And it can go on and on and on and on and on. But ultimately the inyan of the moon is higher than the inyan of the sun. Just like the inyan of the Yidden is higher than lahavla inyan of the other nations. It's atam hamayat mikol amim. Yisrael are called katan. But in the end, the cotton becomes bigger than the gadol. In the end, the moon becomes bigger than the sun. And that's what Machar Chodesh speaks to in part. The idea that a limitation and a flaw and a chesaron can be turned around and made into a big mila. On the first level, it's the simple idea that the sun and the moon, which should be the same size, are not the same size. They're not the same size, so there should be room for both the sun and the moon. And the way they do their work is b'derech mashpia makabel. The sun is the mashpia, and the moon is the makabel, and then the moon, of course, is mashpia. What is makabel from the sun to us? And you have this cycle in which you say, like the Rebbe is going to say in this Mamer, the Jewish people are renewed like the moon. The moon becomes as large as the sun, and all the Maimonim and Siches. I'm just going to reference the Sicha of Yutas Kislev Tafshin Nun Beis, which was a few months before the stroke, where the Rebbe discussed this question also, and spoke about the idea of the moon's light having a higher source than the sun's light. I think also in Parshas Toldos Nun Beis, the Sicha of Kislev, Case Loi, the Rebbe spoke a similar idea where the moon becomes higher than the sun. Avir, which is higher than Oyer. These are all ideas which are someplace in the back of my mind. I hope I'm recalling them and repeating them correctly. But that's what's part of Machar Chodesh. Part of Machar Chodesh is that there's no parity. And because there's no parity, there's on the lower end chesaron. But on the lower end with this chesaron, the chesaron is turned around. Now the way it plays out in the Mamer is not the way I just described it. The Mamer does not talk much about the idea of the sun and the moon. It does mention it, which is why I decided to give you the introduction about it. But the way it plays out in the Mamer is the idea of Moilid, that the moon grows and shrinks and then it disappears. And the disappearance of the moon doesn't mean there's no moon in the sky. It means there's no moonlight reaching the earth. But since the whole reason for the moon is to give life to the earth, light to the earth, so a disappearing moon, as far as we're concerned, has to do with the very purpose of the moon itself. Even though it's just a question of its position in relationship with the sun. But this is why the Eibishter created it, and this is its purpose. And if it can't fulfill its purpose, it has no reason to be. And then there's a new moon born, Moiled. And what makes the new moon really new is the fact that there was a complete interruption. And this idea becomes a metaphor for bittul and chiddush. Bittul and chiddush, that where there's bittul, which is very difficult to translate into English in any useful and constructive and respectable way, then there's renewal, there's something brand new. As is the case with the Jewish people, as will be discussed in this Mamer, again using that Mamer Chazal, Shehei Masidim L'Chadash Kameisa, the Jewish people like the moon are going to be reborn, renewed, like the moon itself. And that's the topic of Machar Chodesh. And that's what this Shir is going to be about. We're going to be learning the first paragraph of the Mamer. Then we're going to go to page 391. Everything, if you follow my PDF, which I have online, you'll see the navigation. The first paragraph we're going to learn, then we'll learn the last 2/3 of 391, then all of 392, and the very top of 393. That'll be it for today, for this Shir. And then the second Shir will be on Har Sinai and Oyel Moed. It starts off with 2 ideas, and 2 becomes 3, and possibly 4. Ukafish is by Lakam. I'm going to say this now, even though it's not important. The end of this Maimon gets a little bit tricky. The details are very hard to understand. The Rebbe's language is very concise and very abstract. And in fact, it says in the Hanocha that they're missing the very end. If you look in the Maimon of Tafshin Lamed Hey in Hanochas Balahak and Teiras Menachem, they tried very hard to figure out the Rebbe's intent. It's interesting. they went back and looked at the Likutei Torah, the source that the Rebbe quotes for the points that he makes. Although you could argue that perhaps the Rebbe here means a little bit differently, but that's in Likutei Torah. I will share what they say, and I'll share what I think when we get to that point. But I'm just saying it now because it's just good to mention that they tried very hard in their hanacha to make sense out of what looks like a very obscure hanacha, and we'll do our best in teaching it you the way how they teach it and the way we understood it, but that'll be in the next year. For right now, we have to start the sugya of Machar Chodesh. Vayomer Yehonasan, that's David HaMelech Machar Chodesh. Tomorrow is going to be Reish Chodesh. As I told you so many times, that in the Lashon Tanakh, the word Chodesh means new month. That's what it means. You're going to be mentioned by my father. Because the seat is going to be missing. David HaMelech is afraid to appear before Shaul, because Shaul is trying to kill him, because Shaul is threatened by him, because Shaul has unfortunately become paranoid, become mad, because the Eibishter told him that through the Navi that the crown of Melucha has been taken from Shaul HaMelech and given to his close friend, and Shaul strongly suspects that its own son-in-law, which is David HaMelech, and he's suspecting correctly. So he doesn't show up, and Shaul asks about him. That in general, Zuhi, this pasuk Vayomer Yehonasan Machar Chodesh, is Haschol Lahoragila, the regular introduction, the regular Dibur HaMaschil b'Mamarim Machar Chodesh, Mamarim, which are taking place at Reish Chodesh. Now, some of them start Vayomer Yehonasan, and some of them start Machar Chodesh, but basically it's considered the same thing. The content of the Mamer Mishtane v'chulu changes from one to the next, which is going to happen today. Now, when the Rebbe says the content of the Mamer change, the truth is they don't change that much. Some of the Mamer go into some of the details later on. V'shilashta teided miyed, about the arrows, and then of course some of the Mamer go into Ad Ki David Higdil. I would argue that the Mamer actually are quite symmetrical, quite the same. But l'chayru, what the Rebbe is talking to is that we're juxtaposing the Machar Chodesh part of this Mamer against Bamidbar, and in that there's an enormous variety, disparity from Mamer to Mamer. And then it continues and he says, then there's Haschol Regila b'Shabbat Pashas Bamidbar. This week is also Shabbos Bamidbar, and as I mentioned before, it's also Shabbos V'Cham Sivan. And the Maimarim of Shabbos Bamidbar also are many Maimarim, but the classic Dibur HaMaschil is Vaydaber V'Geima B'Midbar Sira B'Eil Meyed. The Maimarim begin with the first pasuk in Sefer V'Dabakim Tabba the Shem Mesha B'Midbar Sira B'Chad Chodesh Hashem Shalosh L'Tzeis B'Nei Yisrael Me'et Masayim. So the Rebbe says of all Maimarim, this seems to be the most classic Dibur HaMaschil associated with B'Midbar. So the Rebbe says V'Yeshdavar HaShachas B'Nim. I want to find the relationship between the Machar Chodesh Maimarim, which are rather uniform, and the Pashes HaShavua, which is by definition not uniform. Each Machar Chodesh can be a different Chodesh. Cheshvan and Kislev Tevis, again, I don't know which month Rosh Chodesh could be on Sunday and which month that's not possible. And then of course there's probably more Pashes when Machar Chodesh could be, and when you juxtapose Machar Chodesh against each one of those possibilities, so you have a huge variety of different insights into the Machar Chodesh. So we want to understand the Shachas B'Neim, the relationship between Machar Chodesh and this circumstance, Pashas Chodesh, Sivan, Matan Torah, and Pashas Bamidbar. And he explains, let me tell you how they're saying. The story of the Machar Chodesh means tomorrow's Chodesh, which means the renewal of the new moon. Yeshnam Beza and Yanim. You have the two ideas. Number one, V'Nefkadata, that David HaMelech is going to be remembered, going to be mentioned, going to be asked about. Why is he going to be remembered? Why is he going to be asked about? Because he's going to be missing. And the reason he's going to be remembered is because he's going to be missing. And of course, Chassidus is going to explain that the bittul ki pocket meishavecha causes the zikar. Because he's going to be lacking, which is the idea of ki pocket meishavecha. His seat's going to be empty. It causes subsequent to that dafka because he's missing his zikar, dafka because there's bittul, this chiddush. Says the Rebbe, the same ideas you also have in Pashas Bamidbar. That Midbar Sinai is like Ki Pocket Meshvecha Bittel, and Eyal Meid is like V'Nefkadata being remembered. Midbar Sinai Eyal Meid. V'chein hu b'haseder shabazad. The same is true in the sequence. Shekemoish Aidei Pocket Meshvecha. Just like in the pasuk in Tanakh, when the person's seat is empty, there's an V'Nefkadata that remembered. The vacuum creates the interest. Cain, who I say the Shabazad, Cain, the same is true here. First have Midbar Sinai, which is the idea of bittul and being lacking, which results in Be'el Med, as you'll see in Mitzvah Hashem in the next class on this Mamer. But for right now, the Rebbe says we want to study Machar Chodesh and the juxtaposition of Machar Chodesh against Bamidbar. Now, we're not going to be discussing the second part at all, or almost at all. We're going to be discussing strictly Machar Chodesh. That's our plan for this Shir. So let's begin on page 391, after the double line that I made with my pencil by the number 2. V'hine, Mashakasev Machar Chodesh. The Pasha doesn't begin just by saying that Ki Yipoked Meshavecha when you're going to be missing from your seat, V'nifkalata you're going to be remembered. It starts with saying tomorrow's Rosh Chodesh. Today's not yet Rosh Chodesh. So it starts off a little earlier. Says the Rebbe Moira, this pasuk is saying just before the moon is reborn, and perhaps it's even before the old moon disappeared. It's predicting what's going to happen. It's very near the new birth of the moon, the day before Rosh Chodesh. You have the idea, if not the reality, of Yipoked Meshavecha. Yipoked Meshavecha means your seat is empty. In other words, as you creep towards the new month, the old moon vanishes, and the old moon vanishing is the precursor, the prerequisite to the new moon being born. So Machar Chodesh is speaking of the idea of the old moon disappearing as the prerequisite to the new moon being born. By days of Achakach, then when Chodesh comes, there's the Vinifkalat, and the Eibishter remembers us, as is in the story of Tanakh, that Shaul HaMelech remembers David HaMelech, and he speaks about him, etc. and so on. I gotta throw this in here. Valchvil, and I should have said it earlier, but here it is. Every Haftarah goes on a parsha in the Chumash. Every Haftarah. We have the regular Haftarahs of the Parshas HaShavua. Then we have special Haftarahs of Yom Tif, and the Chodesh, and the Tainiyos, and then Haftarah goes on the Kriya. Except for Machar, and the Chodesh is the same thing. Hashmaim Kisi goes on the over Rosh Hashanah. The Haftarah of Machar Chodesh does not go on any Kriya. Machar Chodesh is not connected to any Parshas HaShavua. There's no Parsha in Chumash that speaks that tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh. There is a Parsha in Chumash that speaks to today's Rosh Chodesh, and that's connected to the Kriya of Rosh Chodesh. And when Rosh Chodesh is Shabbos, you read the Haftarah of Hashemayim Kisi, which parallels the Parsha of Kriya of Rosh Chodesh. Machar Chodesh only exists in Navi, it doesn't exist in Chumash. In other words, the idea of commemorating the disappearance of the old moon in anticipation of the birth of the new moon, this is not in Teda, it's only in the Nevi'im. It's not in Chumash, it's in the Navi. And spiritually this means that there is no idea in the Madrega of Teda Shebeksav, which is the Madrega of Atzilus, of the disappearance of the avoid of a person from before. This is only on a lower level. And of course, on a lower level, it has a higher source, as we always say in the Maimorim. But Machar Chodesh is the only Haftarah that we say, and we say it quite often, that's not linked to any case Haftarah at all. Anyway, the idea of the new moon is when the moon is born again, like the Eibush told Meshach Rabbeinu Kazer, Eva Kadesh, when you see the moon like this, so you should say Mekudesh, it's a new Chodesh. V'nikra b'shem moiled, it's called birth, even though there's no birth at all, there's only one moon. And the light that was shining a few days before Rosh Chodesh, and the light that was shining a few days after Rosh Chodesh is from the same moon, coming from the same sun. Nevertheless, the renewal of that light is called Meled Hashem Sheregel Lifnei Zeh, because one moment before, Hoya Halavana, the moon, was in its relationship with the earth. Betachas Helav has with the ultimate degree of hiddenness and concealment. Ach'eina b'mitzias Klal had no form. And of course, as far as the moon is concerned, it's a who cares? The moon is still there, and the moon is still receiving light from the sun, and the moon is still reflecting light, but it's not in the direction of the earth, it's in a different direction. But in Pnimius HaYanim, when you look into Torah, and you understand that it's Takel Berais Abara Alma, and Kol Elam Kulei Nivra L'Sham Sheni, that the Torah is the blueprint of the world, and the whole purpose of the world is to serve the Torah, and the Torah says to the moon, your purpose is L'Hayir Ala Oris, to give light to the earth. When the moment comes, when the moon is unable to give light to the earth, the moon is essentially without any purpose, which is bad, right? It has to be corrected. And the correction is that a new month is born, a new light emerges, and so on and so forth. And then, because of the earlier disappearance, there emerges of an ifkadata that a new moon is born, which names the Kodesh. The Eibishter remembers and gives a new light. So this is how we understand the relation between the sun and the moon, and the moon's variability, the moon's constant changes from very small to bigger, bigger, bigger till full, and then smaller, smaller till disappears, and then it's renewed and it's reborn. And this is a very, very important thing in Yiddishkeit. And as I said to my beginning, this is also reflecting the idea that the Eibishter did not allow parity, the insaneness, remain in his world, because that would not have worked at all. Now the Rabbi continues, the aforementioned about the moon has everything to do with the Jewish people, because it's that way by the Jews. And actually, the way it is by the Yidden is the cause of how it is by the moon, and not the effect. Because by Yidden, there's a concept of disappearance and reborn called Zikaron. By the moon, there's a similar thing. Not that this way it is by the moon, that's why it is by Yidden, but because this way by Yidden, that's why it is by the moon. Dehine, we know that Yisrael Meinim L'Levan, the Jewish people count by the moon. We keep a lunar calendar, right? As you know, the Christians keep strictly a solar calendar. They have 365 and a quarter days, whatever it is, a Julian calendar, Gregorian calendar, which reflects the length of the solar year. The Muslims, Lahavdil, keep strictly a lunar calendar. They have 12 lunar months, which means that every 36 years that we have, they're going to have on average 37 years, because every year they lose 11 days, from 365 and a quarter to 354. And if you add up 11 times 36, it amounts to a whole year, whole lunar year, 12 lunar months. Which is why in the Muslim calendar, Yom Tovim do not have a season. The holidays that they have can occur at any time of the year. But by Yossi it says that and the holidays have to be in season. So therefore we use both the solar and the lunar calendar. We keep the solar calendar to keep it balanced. There should be seasons. And we use the lunar calendar to reflect the nature of the Jewish people of disappearance and reappearance and rebirth. But if you're using two calendars at the same time, how do you make it fix? How do you make it work? Which is called the Shnas Ha'iba. You add every second or third year an extra month to balance it out. The reason the Jewish people count by the moon is a fee. Because the Jewish people are like the moon. And he brings from the Lashon HaSiddur, from the Gemara, the Jewish people are going to be renewed like the moon is going to be renewed. In the footnote 18 is Messiah Gemara in Sukkah. The Jewish people are like the moon, that they're reborn. But it's not that Jewish people are like the moon because they're reborn. The moon is like the Jewish people. The real issue is when the Eibishter designed the Jewish people, he designed them to be a cotton, to be smaller than the other nations. But a cotton gadol year, that the small year becomes greater and even greater. Then the Ummah Sa'el, who is inferior to, the same is true with the moon, it starts out smaller, but it becomes even bigger than the sun. But it's this way first by Yidden, and second by the moon. The reason the Jewish people are compared to the moon, this is the Gemara in Chulin that I mentioned in the introduction. The Yid, who's called a cotton, counts to the moon, which is called cotton. The Yisrael cotton, the Jews are called small, like it says in the pasuk, Yaakov Yankiv Ki cotton who, that the eat of Yankiv is that he's cotton. By David it also says David who are cotton. We count our calendar by the lunar calendar, which is the smaller of the two luminaries. But as I mentioned before, we don't only count by the moon, we count by both. But we also count by the moon to denote the idea of change and disappearance and reappearance and rebirth for Chuli. The idea is, as we see them in the moon, their source is not Yidden like the moon, but the moon is like Yidden. Because by Yidden, there is a relation with the Eibishter which is called cotton, and there is a cycle involved in that relationship, so we're called cotton. And therefore, the idea is the way they are in the moon, they happen because it happened with the Jewish people. So the key is Yidden, and that Yidden, the Eibishter created Yidden in such a way there isn't parity, and the cotton becomes greater than the gadol by Yidden. And the same is true by the moon, which is like Yidden. And now the Rebbe concludes, which leads us to the following conclusion: being mentioned because you're missing. Sheba as it is in the moon, nimshach is affected by the fact Sheba Avedasam shal Yisrael by Yidden. It's this way, that by Yidden, the way we exist altogether in our basic existence, and then in the specifics of our existence through time, that we experience first. The seat of Yidden is empty. We seem to be missing and bare. That's how we're remembered, and we regrow, we become big again, as it is by Yidden, and because it's this way by Yidden, this is how it is by the moon as well. The descent of the neshama into this world is a terrible descent from a very tall mountain. It's a very deep pit, and the Rebbe is going to explain on the next page that this is called Yerida Tzerech Aliyah. The Yerida is for the sake of the Aliyah. And the same idea you have by Yidden, that Yidden go through this terrible Yerida for the sake of the Aliyah, and the Rebbe is going to develop what the neshama is, and therefore he's going to explain what the Yerida is, and therefore he's going to propose what the Aliyah that follows is, and all of this is going to help us understand how it is by the moon. Machar Chodesh v'nifkalata, that the disappearance of the moon is a Yerida Tzerech Aliyah. Says the Rebbe, Yerida Sanashama Lamata, is a Yerida Gedela v'Yigral bin Amikta. Sharei, emphasis, Hanishoma, Yeshnek Misha Lamayla, the Neshama exists on high. And over there, it's Bebchinas Tehedi, it's on a level which is pure. Higher than pure is holy. But pure also means something very extraordinary. And in Kabbalah, it's Elam Atzilus, because Atavras is Bria, and Atiyitzar is Yetzira, and Atanafach is Asiya. So, Tehedi is Atzilus, and this Tehedi is Eid Lifnei Barasa, before the Neshama is created, the Madreg, which you call Bria. And before the Neshama is created, the Madreg, which is called Yetzira and Asiya. It exists on a level of Atzilus. However, a Metzias can be in Atzilus, the Neshama exists in Atzilus, and in the world of Atzilus, it's the Madreg of Tehedi. And he continues, the Neshama's original source is even higher than Tahira. And of course, if you wanted to use language, you'll call it Kedusha. As it's explained in many places, the Bechinas Tehedi, and I'm on page 392 now, the level of the Neshama which is called pure is like the head, that although it's Tchilas Einyan, it's the beginning of everything that's going to be, like the beginning of a body. It's the seminal source of everything, and therefore it includes everything that's going to be. Then it feeds everything that's going to be subsequent, and of course it also feels. The head is the first organ to form, and from the head itself the remaining organs develop. The head feels all the other organs, it nourishes, it provides all the other organs with their need, and it keeps them integrated. Nevertheless, the core and root of the neshama is l'mayla gamei bechinas tehei. It's even higher than the madreg of tehei, which he calls the gulgalaysim, to their skulls, which is a reference to the Bamidbar part of the Mamer, which is going to be the next year. This is the only place where something from the other Mamer is alluded to in what I'm teaching you in this class, the idea of the skull. That says in L'Kutei Teira, the skull is above the head. Makefes 11, and embraces it, it surrounds it. Similarly, the Madreg of Tahira, he would be like the head, and above Tahira is, I'm going to call it Kedusha, is the Gulgalaysim, Makef, Keser. The L'Kutei Teira explains, and there is a need to be to raise up the head, which is again a pasuk connected to the Bamidbar part of the Mamer. But this is the idea of raising up the Madrega of a Yidden, which is in the level of Tahira, the Gulgalaysim, to the Madrega which is even higher than Tahira, which is the Madrega of Gulgalaysim. In other words, the head needs to be lifted. The Bechinas HaGulgailas, to the level which is called the Gulgailas, the skull, which is above the head, which is Sheirish V'Iker HaNeshama, the root and core of the Neshama. And look at the next four words, Bechinas Yechida, that Gulgalaysim in this Maimeh doesn't mean Kesed in the classic sense, Galgalta, Keser Sheba Keser. It means Yechida, which is deeper than Keser and even higher than Yechida. Now in some Maimarim, that's already the Yerida Tzerech Aliyah. In some Maimarim, the Neshama is Tahirihi, and Yerida Tzerech Aliyah is that it goes up to higher than Tahirihi, higher than Reish, to the Madreg of Gulgalaysim, but not in this Maimer. In this Maimer, the Yerida is not only of the level of the Neshama called Tahira, but even the level of the Neshama called Gulgalaysim, which includes Yechida, Ve'ed Yeser, which is even higher than the Yechida, the very, very essence of the Neshama. And even the very essence of the Neshama has a Yerida when coming into this world, and somehow there's a Tzerech Aliyah. This becomes very curious if you're not talking about the Madreg of Tahiri, but you're talking about the Yechida. And Lamaila said, how could something which is even higher than Yechida have a Yechida Tzedach Aliyah? But that's how this Mamer goes. Kimfu become a Mekamis. Vayomer the Gulgalei some, and the pasuk says to their skulls, Hayru Dagol Geleth Shalahem, it belongs to the Gulgals of the Jewish people, meaning Lefishgam Bechinazu, even the level of Yechida. And even the level which is higher than Yechida is a Chodesh on the Shmasma as the root of the Neshama. Like it says in many Maimarim, that one of the unique characteristics of the Neshama is that even only a very small portion of the totality of the Neshama can go into a guf. You cannot have one Neshama and two gufs at the same time. Not because it can't be, but because the nature of the Neshama is called the Pnimi B'yetzim, which translates basically into that it's very loyal. And loyal means if my Neshama is invested in this guf, all the rest of the Neshama, the Yechidah or Lamayla Yeseh, which is not in the guf, is also involved with that guf, and it cannot be in a different guf. And then from the Madreg of Gulgalesim, which is Yechidah and higher than Yechidah, and from the Madreg of Tehedi, which is Reish, which is the Madreg of Atzilus, it comes down to the four rungs, which is the Dalat Elamis. Atzilus, Bri, Yitzir, Asiyah, Tehedi, Brasi, Yitzart, and Afachta. The parallel four rungs in the person who's an Eilam Katan, like it says in the office that Abnasan, right? He's been signed to Tanchuma. Eilam Katan Zeh Ha'adam, he's been signed to Tanchuma in footnote 23 with a star. So this person is a small world, and in this case, it's not just a small world, these are small ishtalshalos, all of the worlds. So every madrega that's paralleled by the Golgolesam and by Roish and all of the rest is included in Eilam Katan Zeh Ha'adam, Shem Shlivas HaNeshama, which are the rungs of the Neshama, Va'ad, and where does it end up? Shabal Eilam Hazeh HaTachn. This Neshama, with all of its levels, including the Yechidah, and Lamayla Yeseh come into this world, Hatachtim, which is the lowest, Hakashmi, which is physical, Vachumri, which is crude, Beguf Nefesh Bahamas, the body and the animal soul of a Yid, and all of this is Yid Tzedach Aliyah. So we're not saying that the Aliyah is from the Madreg of Reish to the Madreg of Golgolaisa. We're saying that the Yerida includes the Madreg of Reish and the Madreg of Golgolaisa. And therefore the Aliyah which follows has to be even higher than the Madreg of Golgolaisa, no matter how high Golgolaisa is. The Yerida Zui Tzedach Aliyah, says the Rebbe, that this Yerida of the Neshama, which is Tahirahi, and even higher than Tahirahi, the Madreg of the Golgolaisa, which includes Yechida and Lamayla Yeser, comes into the Guf, that even though only the lower levels of the Neshama actually go into the Guf, but the Chodesh al Neshama is also connected to the Guf, so they also have to have a Nifmaliyah. Shaydei Yipakid Meishavecha, that in this Guf there is a phenomena of the space being emptied, which is the day of Bittul. Even if Kalded causes a renewal and a remembrance of the Neshama, which is the Aliyah. And he explains how this plays out. How is this the Aliyah? V'hinei when you talk about the Neshama coming into the Guf, you should know that there's two things. The first is the thing you spoke about before, which is Yid Tzedach Aliyah, which is for the sake of the Neshama. And Tachlas, it's a Neshama, the reason it's done is B'shvil Takin is a Guf and Nefesh HaBahamis. It's not just for the sake of the Aliyah of the Neshama, but it's to correct the body and the animal soul. The Neshama Atzma and Tzichat, there's nothing wrong with the Neshama. The Neshama needs no correction. So if you read between the lines, what the Rebbe is saying here is this. The Arizal says, "Hanashama atzma ein tzricha tikun elo." The soul itself needs no correction only, and there's two ends to that statement. One of them is Aliyah, that the neshama shef an Aliyah, and the other is a takin as a guf and nefesh b'hamas lakel behem as chay nafsh yeruchiv and nishmasei. That the Alter Rebbe brings stuff perek lamed alf and Tanya. So here the Rebbe is saying there's two reasons for Yidus Neshama B'Guf. One is for the sake of the Neshama's Aliyah, and the other for the sake of the elevation of the Guf at Nefesh Bahamis and the world. But he says Tachlis is a Neshama Lamata, meaning even though there's two gains from the coming into this world, but the reason it happens, the reason the Eibishter allows, like it says in Perek Lamed, Lama Osavai Kacha, why does the Eibishter put the Neshama into the Guf? It's not only for the sake of the Aliyah, it's the Takin as the Guf at Nefesh Bahamis. So there are two gains from Yidus HaNeshama Lamata. One is that the Neshama is going to have an Aliyah. The other is there's going to be Metakin and the Guf of the Nefesh HaBahamis. But if not for the second one, this is how I'm understanding the Rebbe's words, the first one wouldn't happen. But because there's the second one, there is also the first one, which in addition to the neshama coming into this world and being mekataka in the guf of the nefesh habahamis, and in a line later, the Rebbe is going to mention also chalkei ba'olam, there's also aliyah for the neshama as well. The purpose of the descent is which will attack into the guf of nefesh habahamis is to correct the body of the animal soul, the world. That says in Tiny chapter 37, the world is divided up into 600,000 parts. Every neshama clause has one of those parts. We come into this world, we do our mission, and we elevate our peace in the world. And what is the avodah that's going to be divided, the guf, the nefesh habahamis and chalkei ba'olam, which is going to set up the second inyan, which is the inyan of Yerid Tzedek Aliyah? Says the Rebbe, lifel bittel b'haguf nefesh habahamis, to effect that the body and the animal soul should have a bittel to the Eibishter. And of course, you learn in Tanya Perek Lamed Hey and Perek Lamed Zayin that the bittul has to do with Torah mitzvahs. First of all, bittul hayesh. You give away your will, you give away your ego, batel retzein cham epnei retzeinei, you give yourself away to the Eibishter, bittul, and this opens you up to v'ad lebittul b'metzias. That when we're mevatel ourselves for our own efforts, alakus rests upon the guf, the nefesh habahamis, the physical mitzvahs, and you become included in godliness, which is bittul b'metzias. Means, as if you're standing in the presence of the king, and the presence of the king is enveloping you. And he adds, v'leirak, this idea that the neshama comes down into this world, that the Rebbe said before, but that's not the reason it happens. Because the reason it happens is tachlis, is because of tikkun. But since there's going to be tikkun of the guf of the nefesh habahamis, there's also going to be aliyah to the neshama, so the Rebbe said you should know that this bittul to the guf of the nefesh habahamis is leirak, it's not only shah neshama, that the neshama gam kameshi beguf of nefesh habahamis, as it's contained within the body and animal soul, tia b'bchinas bittul, she be in a state of bittul, kiyim shegam guf of nefesh habahamis, the body and the animal soul themselves, yeh b'bchinas bittul, should be said to bittul. It says in Tanya Perek Lamed Hey that there's no way to tell your guf to do a mitzvah without the collaboration and the partnership of the animal soul, because the neshama is too far away from the guf, and what brings the neshama close to the guf is the nefesh habahamis, and therefore anytime you're doing a mitzvah, the guf is bottle and the nefesh habahamis is bottle as well. The pasuk says that even the madrega of ava b'chol avav includes also the nefesh habahamis, which means that the avoid of Torah mitzvahs is not only payal a bitl on the neshama in the guf, it's payal a bitl on the guf as well. The zehu inyan, that this whole process of bitl of the guf and the nefesh habahamis, and ultimately chalkei ba'olam through the Yerid neshama into the guf, is inyan yipoket meishavach. Your seat is vacated, which is inyan habitl, and this sets the stage for v'nifkadeta, the idea of zikaron. It's not just that the neshama is in a state of bittul. Kim gam b'meishavecha, you pocket meishavecha, touches the Rebbe. That your seat is empty. Your seat is bittul. Your seat is emptied, as if the seat is itself not there. That the guf of the nefesh habahamis, which is the moishav of the neshama, is also bottle. V'aydei chalkei ba'olam is also bottle. So the Yerid neshama lamata, which ultimately is going to be Yerid tzedek aliyah. But the tachas, the reason the Yerida happens is you have to deal with Misak and the guf of the nefesh habahamis chalkei ba'olam, and bring a bittul to them also, and then the neshama gains consequently the inyan of aliyah in the neshama as well. If we can remain stuck on this, I'm stuck on this, I've been stuck on this for many years, that there's neshama atzmo ein tzricha tikkun. It's an opening of a statement. The soul itself needs no correction. Then there's the end of that statement, el aliyah, it only needs an ascent, an aliyah. But those words, an neshama atzma ein tzricha tikkun, has another conclusion. An neshama atzma tzricha tikkun ella. I can read the word from Tanya Perek Lamed Aleph. Lakel behem chayi nafshei ruchi v'nishmasei, to cause an aliyah in the guf and the nefesh habahamis as well. Yerid zu tzedek aliyah lahalas laHashem kol nefesh achayunis, not aliyah in the neshama, but nefesh achayunis habahamis v'chol uvusheha machshava dibur u'maaseh, and so on. And on top of page Mem Aleph, Amud Aleph, lakel behen chayi ruchi nafshi v'nishmasei. So the neshama comes into this world to elevate the guf, the nefesh habahamis and chalkei ba'olam, or to be masakin, they need to be corrected, and to have an aliyah in the neshama. But if you read the language of this Mamer, the neshama would not come down just for the sake of the neshama's aliyah. Since it's coming down for that other purpose, which justifies the Yerida, which is to be masakin in the guf of the nefesh habahamis chalkei ba'olam, there's the secondary gain of the neshama having an aliyah. Now, The Rebbe finished the paragraph by describing bittul. Bittul of the guf, bittul of shabahamis, bittul chalke veilam, not just bittul in the nisham. And he said that this bittul is the kiyipokin mishavach. Now comes the v'nifkadata. And if I'm not wrong, the v'nifkadata is the aliyah of the neshama. The kiyipokin mishavach is not just that you're a bottle that you're not on imitziyas. You come into this world and you engage with the guf of nefesh and you mavatal them, like the Rabbi said, bittul hayesh, which means the bittul b'mitziyas. That's all in the kiyipokin mishavach. The v'nifkadata that the Rebbe just mentioned, what the Rebbe is going to be discussing now, I think that's all the aliyah in the neshama. And let me preface the next paragraph by making an obvious observation. In many Maimorim, when they speak about Yidit Tzerech Aliyah, they say the neshama starts out as Roish, as Tohayrehi, and this Uas Roish is the Madrega of Golgoloisim, the Keser. In this Maimah, I think it's very clear that the Madrega of Golgoloisim itself has the Yerida. The Madrega that the Rebbe calls Yechida L'mal Yechida is part of the Yerida. So if the Madrega of Yechida L'mal Yechida is the Yerida, what could possibly be the Aliyah? And the answer is V'nifkadata, that the Eibishter remembers us. And if you look at the end of the paragraph, the Rebbe is going to use the words Teifes Mochem Kvayochel. This, I think, is going to be the point of the Rebbe. A neshama comes into this world, and the neshama, before it comes into this world, you're talking about madrigas of tehera and higher than tehera, yechida and higher than yechida. Can't be more bottled than the Eibishter. But the nature of the bittul of the neshama is that it's not teifes makom. In the Eibishter, the neshama is nothing. The Yerida Tzerech Aliyah doesn't mean it's going to a higher level, that in a place where it should be not teifes makom, it becomes important to the Eibishter. I believe that's the pshat in this Mamer. The Yerida Tzerech Aliyah is that the neshama goes from being so bottled that it's not teifes makom to being so bottled that it is teifes makom. And let's begin to read this new paragraph based on that approach. V'hinei. Aidei Avedas with the bittul hayesh refers to the bittul hayesh of the guf of the nefesh habahamis, which is the yipokin mishavach. And the Rebbe mentioned in the previous paragraph that included in that bittul hayesh is the bittul b'mitzias. We bittul the guf to the Eibishter in doing mitzvahs, like the Alter Rebbe describes in Perek Lamed Hey and Perek Lamed Zayin. Perek Lamed Hey and Perek Lamed Zayin. And then the Eibishter rests on the guf and the nefesh habahamis and the chalki ba'elam. And when the Eibishter rests, there's a higher bittul which we'll call the bittul b'mitzias. So both of those, side the bittul hayesh, side the bittul b'mitzias, are part of the yipokin mishavecha. And then after all of that, after you do the avoid of being mesak in the world, nasa v'nifkadata in zikaron l'mal, the Eibishter remembers. And this zikaron is not a part of the tikkun of the guf of the nefesh chalki ba'elam. That's after that's finished, because the tikkun of the guf of the nefesh chalki ba'elam is the bittul, is the yipokin mishavecha. When all of that is done, the neshama has an aliyah, and the neshama is having aliyah. It's called zikaron. The Yedua, Pirish Mamer as Levi by knows the Gemara is brought so many more Chassidas. The work of tzaddikim is greater. The work of the Eibishter, right? Why is it? There's a number of different insights. The Eibishter made the world with one hand. The tzaddikim is made with two hands. But here the Rebbe brings a different word, the Chassidish word. The Bria Shemaim v'Aretz is Me'ayin Liyesh. The creation is from a non-existential world into an independent form of creation. Yesh. And Ma'aseh tzaddikim, and the Rebbe says in the bracket, Avodas Kol Yisrael, because v'amir kolam tzaddikim, is bittul hayesh. From yesh to ayin, the world that the Eibishter created to be separate from him, we re-include in him, we make it back into ayin. And the Rebbe says, what we do is greater than creation. Making from an ayin to a yesh is a lesser chiddush than making from the yesh that the Eibishter made into an ayin. And he brings the Gemara, which we all know, that Godel Nesa Ach Eitz Manishim, because Mishmaya Me'av Yav Mishkal Yisrael. The Gemara with the Chanina ben Deisa, that him and his wife were very poor, and she complained, so he davened, and a leg came from heaven from gold, which was very substantial. It was a great largesse, could have fed them very nicely. And then she saw that in Gan Eden, their leg, the table that they're going to sit at as a couple, is missing a leg, and she asked that they should take it back, and they did. Rabbi Chanina was responsible to go back, and the Gemara says that this is the second miracle, that they took the leg back is bigger than the first miracle, because Mishmaya Me'av Yav, the heavens give, Mishkal Hashaka, they don't take back. Because giving is from ayin to yesh, taking back is from yesh to ayin. In other words, the Eibishter made a world to be separate from him. We take the world which he made separate from him and rejoin it with him, and this is considered a bigger chiddush. Now, why it's a bigger chiddush is a clear, it's a ganze Indian, but part of it certainly is that we don't make it from the yesh into ayin, we make it from the yesh into the yesh amiti. But let's not go into that because the Rebbe doesn't go into it. Says the Rebbe, this is the pshat. We have the avodah of ki yipoken meshevech, of bittul. We bittul the worlds to the Eibishter. Bittul yesh and bittul b'metzias, which basically means we take the world and we make it ice. Nothing. Which is meyesh la'ayin. But then comes the v'nefkada thing, and as a Kohen Hashem remembers us. And I'm going to speak words that this is not from yesh to ayin, this is from yesh to yesh amiti, which is a big chiddush. The concept of being remembered by the Eibishter means what? That we're dealing with bechina kazu, we're talking about a lakus in such a madrege, that the entire creation, all the worlds, have no relativism, have no value whatsoever. The Gabi Atzmas, everything is nothing. And therefore, of course, Hashem knows everything. And Hashem doesn't forget anything. But we're not distinct in what we are. We're part of the continuum of creation of everything because we're nothing next to Him. And that's why it becomes necessary to have Hashem remember us. Hashem doesn't forget, so we have to remember. Hashem never forgets. And therefore the shaila is, why could there be a concept of the Eibush needing to remember us? The answer is, of course He knows us. But He knows us in the kind of way we're a part of everything. And we're not distinct into what we are. There's a lack of substantive identity of the creation per se. And He knows us as a part of our lack of substance. And the degree to which the creation is of little value to the Eibishter is it's not like we're like nothing, we're literally nothing. So He knows us, but He knows us as He knows Himself. He knows us as we're part of Him. But we as us is gunish, is nothing. And that's why you have to even to come. By the way, this is the same idea which is brought in the Mamer of Rosh Hashanah, that we first have Malchis, and then Zechrenis, and then Shefris. So one of the questions that the Mamer often asks is, first Hashem should remember us, then we can become His king. And Beklal, how could we forget? And the Mamorim say the same thing. That Zechrenis doesn't mean Hashem is remembered because He forgot. Zechrenis means Hashem is making us distinct. But Yada Lakim is B'nei Yisrael, Vayeda Lakim, in a place where we have no distinction. In other words, it's a chiddush. It's not a heder chasaron, it's a maila. Hashem didn't forget, but He knows us as a part of Himself, and we want to be identified as an entity, as a thing. To be identified as a thing in the Gabi the Meibishten is a chiddush, that we should be substantive enough that we could say the Eibishter remembers us. A tfisas makom. We're totally bottled to the Eibishter, but we, as a totally bottled entity to the Eibishter, are remembered by the Eibishter. And again, I'm going to use the language, even though the Rebbe doesn't use it, that not the Yesh is becoming ayin, which means nothing, because that's part of the ki pocket meshevecha. The Yesh is becoming Yesh amiti, and that's the infant zikaron. In order to have the Eibishter remember us on this level, where by ourselves we're nothing, we have to first do the Aveda Bitla Yesh, which is part of the ki pocket meshevecha. And as I mentioned to you before, the bittul yesh includes also a bittul b'metzias, but it's all about being lost in the grandness of Elokus. The bezesh apel bittul yesh, when a person affects in the world bittul yesh by using it to serve the Eibishter, and the Eibishter is manifesting. Even though when the Eibishter created the world, He created with that koyach she'ein le'ilu v'sibit shkot nechas v'shalom. In other words, Hashem made the world to be the kind of creation that should perceive itself as being completely independent, just like the Eibush is independent. But the Eibush's independence is Yesh Amiti. This world's independence is Yesh Sheker, Yesh Nivra. But in the perception of the creation, in relationship with the creation is a Yesh. We take a creation that was designed by the Eibishter to be self-centric, that the truth of me is me, and bittul it to the Eibishter. And bittul yesh is not enough. After we have the bittul yesh, there's the bittul b'metzias. We give it to the Eibishter in His service, and then He rests upon it and raises it up to madrega bittul b'metzias, and even higher than bittul b'metzias is bittul b'tachlis. So if we do the avodah of ki yipoked meishavecha properly, there's no world. There's only Eibishter. So what's the v'nefkadeto? So he explains, in inyan zeh, this idea, Taifas Makom, should be of import to him, to the Eibishter, to the extent that this completely bittled world to him should be identified as a specific memory, so to speak, Gamba Bachin in such a place, Shisham he lochashiv, that over there it's not like nothing, it's nothing literally, and that's the Zikarna v'nefkadata. The Zikarna v'nefkadata is that not only we're included in a lakus, and he knows us as a part of a lakus, we're identified as something, so to speak, within the lakus that has a tfisas makom l'gabei atzmos. And l'cheira, that's the pshat and the yidid tzerach aliyah. I'm going to repeat again. The neshama comes into this world, first of all, to be mesaken the guf and the shemtech al-kabelim, which is to raise the yesh into ayin. And second of all, there's going to be a schar of an ifkadata. And the schar of an ifkadata is not making the yesh into ayin, but to making the yesh into an emes. That we should have tfisas makom l'gabei atzmos. And that's the pshat in Machar Chodesh. Machar Chodesh means Jews cycle. The moon, which is like Jews, cycles because the Jews cycle. And the nature of this cycling is that it involves bittul and metzias. And only because there's bittul is there the metzias on this madreg of zikaron that, so to speak, in atzmos, we matter to him kvayochel. And this is the only way I can explain that when you speak about the madreg of gugulaisim, which means yechidon l'mayla yoser, and you say that they're part of the yerida. In other words, the Yerid is not only into Madreg of Rosh, and the Aliyah is to the Madreg of Golgolaisim, as it is in so many Maimon. But the Yerid is even the Madreg of Golgolaisim itself. So what's the Aliyah? The Golgolaisim by itself, Yechid or Lamayla Yeser, is not Tefes Makom Gabi Atmos. And the Aliyah is that it should be Tefes Makom Gabi Atmos. I believe that's the Pshat in this Maimon. So this is the first Shir on half a Maimon, Machar Chodesh. And there's a lot of very interesting ideas here. This idea that the Yerida includes the higher than Yechida and that the Aliyah is the Zikaron is fascinating. The next Shir is going to be on the other half of Mamer, which is about Bamidbar, Midbar Sinabay al Mayat. And over there, we have two things here, right? The Ki Yipoked Meshevech is the Bittel, and the Nefkadat is the Zikaron. Over there, we're going to have, that's going to be broken down into Kama Madregas. Okay, a good Shabbos.